Let's start by looking at the color pieces for this bra. Here, because the lining and the outer fabric are made of the same material. So it consists of two parts. You can normally use white fabric for the lining, and each size of these color pieces is different. So which color pieces are specifically involved? Everyone should follow their own blueprints. However, there is one aspect that is the same, specifically on the color pieces of our bra. They all have a numerical identifier. Let's first discuss the colored piece in the middle. Specifically, it refers to the colored piece with the number 1. This colored piece is available in different sizes. It just requires the number 1. For example, the colored piece shown in the video. This one in the middle only needs a single piece. But there are some colorful pieces of number 1. It is just half. It should resemble the colorful pieces of 2 and 3 on its left. We will flip it over and color these colorful pieces of 2 and 3 on the other side. Also, everyone must ensure to mark clearly when drawing. For example, these drawings that I turned over. I added an extra dot on top. This way, we won't get confused when assembling later. Everyone can use any method they like to make marks. I just drew a dot here. Do it according to your own preferences. The sewing methods for the outer fabric and the lining are the same. I will sew the outer fabric first. I have already mentioned this earlier. The fabric I'm using for both the outer layer and the lining is the same. So I'm using one piece as the outer layer. Arrange the colored pieces in the correct order. Sew the two adjacent edges together with the right sides facing each other. I will start sewing from right to left. The stitches here are all aligned with the right sides facing each other. Then its seams should be split to both sides. After everything is stitched together, then sew a visible line on both sides of each seam. I have already finished sewing the visible lines here. This is how it appears after sewing. Next, repeat the previous steps. Also join the lining together. Next, gently pull the visible thread. Then we'll sew a border onto the outer fabric. The edges of the embroidery must align with the underlying guideline. I recommend hand sewing for this step. I also use hand sewing myself. There is another method for edge sewing. We shouldn't sew it together in the middle. However, it has almost reached a flat state in the end. Let's address this edge again, right on this back side, specifically on the side that is close to the doll's body. Hand sew a circle here. This method is quite simple for us to operate, but if we turn it over to this side, we can see the edge of the drawing. If we sew it between 2 layers of fabric, then the edge will definitely be hidden. However, it will be relatively more difficult to operate. So which specific method should be used for edging? Everyone can choose based on their own skill level. It looks like this after sewing. I did this by hand. Hand sewing will be a bit more precise. Next, we will place the lining and outer fabric with their right sides facing each other. The outer fabric with the sewn edge goes on the top layer. We need to sew all the way around here. Following the stitching, a notch needs to be left here. For example, if it's my notch, it may be positioned further down. About 2 centimeters should suffice. Make sure the notch is away from the side edge. At least leave 1 centimeter. This way, when we sew later, it's easy to flip this corner. Then we'll start sewing from this point on the left side of the opening. Sew along the top and bottom seams. Then you should pay attention while sewing. The position of this style at the top and bottom. Try to align them as closely as possible. Sew to the edge that has lace. We will sew along the lace's stitching. Drive to the other turnaround point. Then let's adjust the style a bit. Trim the corners diagonally at all 4 right angles. Make a diagonal cut here at the vehicle's trim edge. The sharp corner in the center, cut straight in like this, but be careful not to cut the threads. Then there are curved sections next to it. Also make some cuts, then we flip it from the back opening. After flipping, we tidy it up and iron it. Sisters who have measured the lines well. You can position the edges, measure all the lines. If you're unsure about how to measure the line, we'll iron it to make it smooth. Sew the area with the reverse stitch using a long needle. Lastly, double check the positions at the back. Regarding this section at the back, we'll sew on a hidden button or apply Velcro, because I have left this extra buttonhole. If you don't want this buttonhole, you want to use that grommet method. Finally, tie the bag. You can trim a little of the material behind the opening inward, trimming about 3 millimeters.
Now we will demonstrate how to do the long stitch. First, the end of the thread is tucked inside the fabric. We need to pull the needle out from inside the fabric. Aligning with this exit point, we insert the needle into another piece of fabric above. Can we see it directly from this point? This point is the same as that point. Then we enter from this side and exit this place. The distance between the entry and exit points of the needle on my side is about 3 millimeters. It's okay if you can do it a bit more closely when you do it. Then insert the needle at the same point on the fabric below. Needle out about 3 millimeters next door. The next step is also repetitive. It's just doing it up and down continuously. After the suturing is done, you can pull the thread tight. Directly tie a knot with the needle. Then thread this needle through the fabric. Pull it a little tighter. The end of the thread is hidden. Use this awl to pierce through the fabric. The fixed base is threaded up from behind. Then put the lid on. Gently press to secure it. This fixation is unstable. Just make a minor adjustment gently. We also need to tap it with this mold. If you don't have a mold, you can gently tap it with a hammer. Just a light tap will do. If you have a mold, try to use it. It won't deform easily. When tapping, don't hit too hard. Just give it a gentle tap. Feel that the button has snapped into place. It's fine if it feels a bit recessed. Next, we will make socks. The reason I didn't bring it up at the start is that it goes straight to the sewing position, is because if you consider the sewing position, it's simply knitted fabric. You fold it like this. It's quite short here. Using a home machine is not suitable for driving. Let's set aside a little more for it first. After the car is finished, then we'll go trim it. To create a time pattern, the stitching on the socks is more durable. We'll fold it down first. You can have a look. Let's mark these points. It is this point on the other side. This side is the front, the point on the edge of the sock. Mark it. Take a look. This is the front. Then the side we draw on is the back. Marked it. Fold it down. Along this line, where we place the needle, right here with us, the place where we draw. First, let's go back. Reverse 1 or 2 stitches, fasten it slightly, then continue sewing forward. When you reach this point, then make 1 or 2 forward stitches. You also need to do a back stitch. All right, we've reached the new point. Then make 2 back stitches. Stop. Continue walking forward. Walk to this point, then stop again. Similarly, go back 1 or 2 steps. Continue walking forward. Reach this point, then continue the previous operation. Rewind the needle. Let's take a look now. Why do I need to rewind the needle at this point? When we cut it then, it's like this, guiding everyone along this edge. Cut a little at the place where there is a seam. We have the option to rewind the needle here. We often put on and take off like this. It will be a bit more secure. This thread won't come loose either. Now that the line is finished, let's trim it a bit. Just keep it flat like this. Trim the excess stitches. Do not cut this wire. There's no problem with the 3 or 4 millimeters of this wire sticking out. If you had cut it this short from the beginning, then when it's time to give it the car, this edge isn't very good. Okay, now that we've finished cutting, fold it like this. These are all the backs. The lined areas are all the backs. In addition to making several marks on the front side, fold the socks in half along this line at the edge. Remove the stitches. After sewing, follow the edge outward. About 3 to 4 millimeters in position. Cut the socks. Places with a larger curvature need to trim the edges. Be careful not to cut the seams. Don't cut too deep. After cutting, turn the entire sock inside out. The sock is ready. Now let's take a look at this sock that has been ironed. I have pressed the design on this side. The side refers to this direction. Directly iron it here. And this is ironed on the front. It's just to sew it on the side at the back like this. And then iron it flat like this. So regarding my socks, it is located at the ankle area. It is relatively narrow. If you prefer it to be a bit wider, you can refer to our previous issue. Designs for Christmas.
Let's first take a look at the materials for making the sleeves. There are actually 2 materials for it. One is ceremonial fabric, and the other is the outer layer. Here, the outer fabric and ceremonial fabric use the same material. If you are concerned about the ceremonial fabric, you can use white. This narrower one is ceremonial fabric. Then each of them needs to add their own style before cutting it down. Additionally, let's talk about our lace. The lace just needs to add one style, because the other side here doesn't need to be hemmed. So we added 5 millimeters here. The remaining part is what we have on the drawing. This is the actual size. So we first place the fabric and the lining face to face. Sew one of the side edges. Just sew along the top and bottom seam lines. After sewing, we will trim this fabric a bit. The fabric must be trimmed. Leave about 2 millimeters. Then we will open the face fabric and the lining fabric separately. Use your nails to scrape this area. Then we will combine the lining fabric and the face fabric. At this point, their wrong sides are facing each other. The sewing location at the front, this is the current balance position. We can iron it to make it flatter. After organizing it, we measure a line 5 millimeters in from the edge. we need to loosen the strap at this position. You only need to measure a line of about 5 millimeters. I'm using a 3 millimeter elastic band, then place the fabric and the outer fabric face to face. So at this point, the spot where we just sewed the elastic band is now wrapped inside. Then, take out the lace we prepared earlier. The lace and the fabric are facing each other. This one at the bottom is the fabric. The edges and the stitching lines are aligned. Then turn the fabric over, like this. This means that we align the 3 style lines both vertically and horizontally. Then we measure 2 millimeters to the left of the style line. On the right side, we also measure 2 millimeters and draw a line. The line drawn here should be wider than usual for the pleats of a skirt. Or for any other pleats, it should be wider. Here I used a stitch distance of 5. After finishing the stitching, we simultaneously pull tight the 2 baselines to gather the pleats. The dimensions after gathering the pleats are available on our drawing. Everyone adjusts according to the dimensions provided on the drawing. After making adjustments, we directly stitch along the style line to secure it. Then remove the basting stitches from the previous seam. After removing, cut the style a bit. You can also leave about 2 millimeters. The style definitely needs to be refined. At this point, both side edges are not sewn. Let's flip it from this position. It looks like this after flipping it over. Then we will insert the elastic band. The elastic band is threaded through the channel we started sewing. Here I'm using a rethreading device. If you don't have a rethreading tool, you can use a regular pin or something similar. That's fine as well. Length of the elastic band. We have provided a reference value on our drawing. Everyone can take a look. This elastic band is relatively short. After we pull it over, first, temporarily secure this end. Then we continue to pull out the other end. Also, stitch a few temporary stitches here first. After both ends are secured, we will bring the 2 sides together, facing each other. At this moment, the lining we are inserting is relatively wide. We will need to turn it over later. Here we sew directly along the side seam. During sewing, there is a technique next to our lace. First, let's discuss the colored pieces of the group. The one in the middle is the colored piece labeled front piece 1 on our drawing. The one on the left is the colored piece labeled front piece 2. Next, this piece should be drawn on both sides. Draw this piece on the other side. After drawing, all 3 pieces are the front pieces. Then there are 2 back pieces. One of these 2 back pieces has a notch. The one on the left has a notch. The other piece does not have a notch. First, we will stitch the front piece together. Stitch these 2 adjacent lines together. Make sure the front sides are facing each other. Then when we begin stitching, make sure to stitch up to this point and you will be able to hear it. So there's a corner here, just this corner point. Then place the other piece facing the front as well and join it with the middle piece. It should also be stitched to the position we marked in front. After measuring it well, we will take the design we just stitched and spread it to both sides. Sisters who use a water-based pen can iron it a bit. It will be smoother. If I use a hot pen, I just scrape it with my nails. Then we take out 2 back pieces. Sew the 2 adjacent edges together. Here the fronts are also facing each other. After measuring, separate the stitched section on both sides. At this point, it looks like this when turned to the front. Next, we'll adjust the positions of these 2 corners. Here I used a thin interfacing. If there is no interfacing available, using ordinary high branch cotton is also acceptable. We will press the smooth side of the interlining to be the front. It should face the front side of our fabric. Separate design, the seam allowance in this triangular area is covered. You can adjust the style by yourself. Identify the line agent in this area. Then we can directly sew along the identified line, the starting and ending locations. This way it extends outward properly. Adjust the lining underneath. The lining should align closely with the fabric edge. After measuring, the front looks like this. The back looks like this. Next, let's trim the lining a bit. Trim along the edge of the fabric, then cut straight into the pointed corner. This area of the skirt's fabric is not stitched. The main focus is to cut the underlying lining. It's like making a cut in the underlying lining. Next, we turn it to the front, just like in the video. Flip this lining to the inside. At this point, the reverse side looks like this. Next, we need to trim this lining a little. I probably left this much space. Then we iron out this area with a heat press, because we are using fusible interfacing. So here I will apply heat to it. It will stick directly to the fabric. It will be smoother. When flipped to the front, it's clean here too. Then, everyone can repeat the previous method on their own. Work on the triangular area on the other side. Next, we position the side seam beside the 2 back pieces. Measure the bright line on both sides. Be careful when measuring the bright line. The design underneath it is all split to the sides. Also, pay attention to the position of the bright line here. Don't measure it incorrectly. These are the 2 style positions that connect the back piece. This is not what we just stitched. The style position above that triangular section. Then we flip it over to the back side. The bottom edges of these 3 areas. Fold inward along the style line. In this step, we can lightly steam it while folding it up. Directly steam it to shape. Then it will taste better when we eat it later. After steaming, turn it to the front side. Start sewing the clear line from the middle front piece. This clear line. We are sewing on this piece of fabric in the middle front, sewing around the bottom edge back to the starting position. The finished clear line in this middle section looks like this. Next, we sew the bright line at this position on the left side of the vehicle. Here we sew directly along the hem of the back piece. This is how it looks after sewing this part. Next, we sew the bright line on the right side. The bright line at this position is the same as the one at the previous position. This is how the finished sewing looks. Then let's address the positions of the 2 back pieces. Fold it as shown in the video. Try to align the positions of these 2 long edges. Then sew directly along the seam. After finishing, we will turn this seam towards the side seam. Then use a steam iron to press it flat. Next, use the same method to process the seam position on the other side. After this seam position is completed properly, its seam is also facing towards the side seam. This is how it looks after we have processed the two capitals. Next, let's take care of the waistband section. I mentioned earlier that this fabric has interfacing, the fabric used for the skirt. However, I did not use interfacing for the waistband section, because we will complete this part of the waistband shortly. It corresponds to a thickness of 4 layers. So, there's no need to press the interfacing, as it would be too thick. Before we officially sew the waistband, let's first address the opening at the back. This is the location of one of our thick pieces. There's a fastening position here. We'll fold this piece next to it inward and sew it. Sew a visible line on the front to secure it. Once finished, its front looks like this. This is how it looks from the back. If you are concerned that the seam at the back won't hold, you don't need to cut it so wide. Just make a cut of about 3 millimeters. Then we will take care of the opening on the other side. Here we also fold inward along the stitching, but here we shouldn't sew it shut. Just fold it in and press to set it. Once positioned correctly, we turn it to the front. Now it has 2 openings at the back. It's all clean. Then let's take a look at the waist section. Regarding the length of the waist section, I have provided an allowance size. Everyone will have extra pieces left after sewing. Leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. You can trim off the rest. Here, when we measure the seam, it means putting the right sides of the waistband and skirt fabric together. The starting position. This fabric at the waist should have a seam that is 5 millimeters longer than the fabric below. Then measure and sew directly along the upper and lower seam lines. After measuring and sewing, this excess part should also leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. Cut off the remaining part. Then we fold the waist part upward, the position we just stitched. You can scrape it with your nails or press it gently. Make this area more even. Then we flip it to the other side. Sew the unstitched side of the waist. Fold it inward along the seam line. In other words, fold it towards the back side. Also, scrape it with your nails or gently press it. After folding, we will turn it to the front side. Fold down the crease we just created. Align it with the crease where the waist was sewn earlier. Next, we will measure a short line at this position. Please note that this short line should not be sewn into the fabric of the skirt. It is measured from the position along this edge. After measuring, we cut off the excess part here at the waist. A measurement of 2 to 3 millimeters is sufficient. Then repeat the previous method. Address this position on the opposite side. After both sides have been processed, we turn this position to the front. You can adjust it with tweezers. After processing both ends, it looks like this. Then we turn it back to the reverse side. We have 2 methods for this position. One method is to cover it like this. Block the thread of the front seam. Then flip it to the front. At this position, directly sew a stitch to secure it. If you're worried about not being able to sew a neat line, you can use the long needle technique. Sew this crease position together with the thread location below. I have completed the sewing here using the long needle method. Those who are not familiar with the long needle method can check inside the folder. There is a separate tutorial on the long needle method. Then we will align the 2 back sides facing each other. One side has an opening in the back. We simply folded it inward at the front. This side is left unsewn. Here we will first uncover this position. Then we will address the stitched position on the other side. Make a mark 5 millimeters above. Then we will align these 2 points. Sew down along the marked point. When sewing, be sure to pay attention to the fabric underneath. We have opened the horizontal section of this paper. After opening, align it like this before sewing. Turn it to the front after sewing. We will sew at the position we just stitched. Guide to the back piece that does not have buttonholes. In this way, the position above creates a buttonhole. Then there are 2 methods for this step. One method is simply to sew the buttons directly on top. Another method is to first split the seams at the bottom to both sides. Draw a clear line along the edge where there is no buttonhole. This clear line is only stitched on the top of this back piece. It cannot be stitched onto any other fabric. And because it forms a complete circle like this, so it has a bit of difficulty, it will be somewhat troublesome. After completing the top stitching, we will then join the separated stitches at the back. Direct it towards the direction of the top stitch we just made. This will restore it to the state we had earlier with the button placement. Then, to prevent the thread from unraveling from frequent wear and tear, we will measure a short line at this position. This means that we initially sewed the 2 back pieces together at the opening. This is the point where the cut is made. We need to be careful when sewing this short line. The 2 seams below are joined together. And the buttonhole position is also present as it should be. When sewing, you need to pull the side fabric apart.